Today's virtual forum on the Department of the Interior's plan to reopen national parks during the coronavirus pandemic. As chair of the subcommittee on national parks, forests, and public lands, and as an avid user of our public lands, I recognize the immense benefits that our national parks and public lands provide. Throughout this Congress, this subcommittee has been committed to expanding access to public lands, working to ensure that all Americans, no matter where they live or how much they make, are able to reap the benefits of these cherished places. Although enhancing access to public lands will always remain one of our main priorities at this unprecedented time in our nation's history, ensuring the health and safety of park employees, visitors, and local communities is of paramount importance. Unfortunately, it appears that this administration has chosen to politicize access to public lands at the expense of public health and safety. Just look at what happened at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Less than a day after reopening, parking lots were overflowing with visitors from 24 different states, many without wearing masks. These decisions not only threaten the health and safety of park employees and visitors, they also threaten to exacerbate the spread of the coronavirus in the communities that live closest to our national parks, communities that have already been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. It's critical that the administration provide clear, data-driven guidelines and plans that will ensure the safety of visitors, park employees, and gateway communities before reopening our national parks. Unfortunately, from what I have seen thus far, it seems as if the administration has continued to dismiss recommendations and concerns from key stakeholders and local officials. To date, the plans provided by the Department of the Interior have not included any specific requirements for the types of safeguards that must be in place before allowing increased visitation. The guidance also fails to require employees to have personal protective equipment or masks, even if they will be in direct contact with visitors. And importantly, it doesn't require Park Service officials to consult with at-risk populations near national parks, including tribal communities, when deciding to reopen. The Grand Canyon is a case in point. Following the administration's phased reopening of national parks last month, the Navajo Nation, which has seen more confirmed cases per capita than any state in the country, and the Havasupai tribe, whose community members live deep within the Grand Canyon, wrote to Secretary Bernhardt urging him to postpone any decisions to reopen national parks. In spite of these specific requests to delay reopening and the rising number of confirmed cases where the park is located, the administration announced its plans to reopen Grand Canyon National Park and to increase recreational access less than a week after the letters were sent. This clear lack of leadership and political posturing threatens to exacerbate the crisis, especially in our most vulnerable communities. Shortly, we'll hear from President Nez of the Navajo Nation and Councilwoman Tilous of the Havasupai tribe about the risks that prematurely reopening popular national parks pose to tribal communities. It's long past time that the administration listened to the communities who live closest to our public lands and to prioritize public health and safety above all else. Today, we'll also hear from Mr. Phil Francis, Chair of the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks, and Mr. Dan Puskar, President and CEO of the Public Lands Alliance. Before I turn it over to our distinguished panelists, I would be remiss if I didn't take the time to mention that the other crisis that is plaguing our nation, police brutality, rooted in generations of systemic racism. No family should ever have to suffer the pain and sorrow of losing a loved one at the hands of power abusers. And my heart and prayers go out to the loved ones of every person of color who has suffered an unjust death at the hands of those whose duty is to protect and serve. It has never been more evident that our systems have failed you, and I stand with you in your fight for justice, fairness, compassion, and equality. At this incredibly difficult time in our country's history, it's vital that we do not allow anything to overshadow calls for justice and equality. Over the weekend, peaceful protesters gave way to localized destruction throughout the country, including the defacement of some of our nation's most iconic monuments in Washington, D.C. While destruction of property should not be condoned, we cannot allow violence and the vandalism of our national monuments to define the narrative of this critical movement. Instead, we must stand together to ensure that we have the tools to hold those in power accountable, that we have the power to ensure the safety and health of all Americans. Thank you again to our panelists for being here with us today. I look forward to hearing your insights and perspectives on how we can ensure public health and safety when reopening our national parks. And we will move on to our witnesses. President Nez, I can have you first. It looks like you're in transit, so I want you to go first. And I want you also to know, President Nez, that our hearts go out to every family who has lost a loved one on the nation, and we'll offer our continued support to you. President Jonathan Nez was born in Tuba City, Arizona, and raised in Shanto, Arizona. He is the president of the Navajo Nation, and we welcome him today to give his testimony.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair Holland and subcommittee members. I am doing this virtual forum sitting in my vehicle while the warriors are on the front line are distributing food to our Navajo people during this time. And if you see the video, that is what's happening here in Many Farms, Arizona. So the purpose of this meeting is to get input from tribal leaders on the opening of national parks, national monuments, federal points of interest throughout this country. We do have federal lands, federal points of interest in and around the Navajo Nation, as you mentioned, Chairwoman Holland and distinguished subcommittee members. We have the Grand Canyon, we have Bryce Canyon, we got Chaco Canyon, Canyon de Chelly, Hubble Trading Post, and many others here on the Navajo Nation and around the Navajo Nation. Let me just give you some statistics that I recently received yesterday evening. We have tested 35,866 people, more than any other state and in some countries per capita throughout the United States. Over 15% of our population. And 5,479 have tested positive. We also have begun to track our recovery numbers. 1,920 have recovered from COVID-19. Overall, 248 of our people have lost their lives to coronavirus here on Navajo. And as you all know, we are still in a shelter in place here on Navajo, stay-at-home order. We do have curfews because of the increased numbers in positive cases here on Navajo. And as we have seen, states have been opening up their parks, state parks, and also the national parks around us, and their governments and their businesses, while the Navajo Nation is still under a shelter in place because of these increased numbers of COVID-19. And so we are concerned here, committee members, Chairwoman, that all these governments, states around us are opening up. We have begun to see increases in COVID positive off the nation, and that may play a factor into an increase once again here on the Navajo Nation. We are in the peak tourist season now. All our points of interest in our tribal parks are closed. And so when parks and points of interest are being opened up around us, it brings visitors into the Navajo Nation. And so we have told our visitors to please respect the sovereignty of our nation and abide by the lockdowns. Over the weekend, we had a lot of traffic. Memorial Day weekend, a lot of traffic. And I'm surprised that there was no outreach to the states or even to the visitors to let them know that if they are in our nation, they will be pulled over and they will be cited $1,000 for disobeying the curfew. So there was just so much traffic here. I haven't get the numbers of citations yet from our police department, but I'm sure it's high. My time is running short here, but let me end with my visit with Secretary Bernhardt. I did bring up the concern that we have as well. And the secretary did say to us that they are going to open up all the parks because his boss wants them open. And so we know who his boss is. And it's very concerning here in terms of the continued increase in positive cases here on the Navajo Nation. We're doing our very best with the limited resources that we have and the sovereign ability to incorporate public health orders here on the Navajo Nation. So I yield back to you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few words and to give you an overview of what's happening here on the Navajo Nation.
Thank you so much, President Nazin. We will, if you can hang tight with us, we'll have questions for you so we can further understand the situation you're in and hopefully find some solutions for you. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Our next witness is Councilwoman Carletta Tilous. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Councilwoman. She was born and raised in Supai Village, located at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and is a lifelong advocate for the protection of the Grand Canyon and has worked for more than 25 years promoting social and environmental justice for the Havasupai tribe. Welcome, Councilwoman, and you have 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland and representatives and witnesses, and also greetings to President Jonathan Nez and the Navajo Nation. My name is Carletta Tilous. I'm from the Havasupai tribe. I was born down in Supai Village and also resided at the Grand Canyon Park and went to school there as well. I'm here to participate in this important forum on behalf of my tribe and describing a little bit about our concerns regarding this coronavirus and the reopening of the Grand Canyon National Park. My home, again, is located at the bottom of the canyon. We are one of the most remote villages of all the tribes in the Northern Hemisphere. And the only way to get in and out is hiking, helicopter, or riding a horse. And so the challenges to sustain a community down there during a pandemic is very challenging. So we're very concerned about our small tribe of 757 tribal members left, and we are trying to protect our people from this dangerous pandemic. And we are very concerned about the opening of the Grand Canyon National Park, which is going to allow millions of visitors to come through with no real emergency plan, no real protection to ensure that my people and my community is going to remain safe. Due to this pandemic, we are afraid that my people will be extinct. This is a very dangerous pandemic and it will spread very rapidly. And we are very concerned about that. We also have a small community in the Grand Canyon National Park because my people used to own the Grand Canyon, or we still own the Grand Canyon. And there were some of us that remained there and refused to move when the Grand Canyon National Park was established. And so we have families living there that moved out of Supai very recently because of the need for health care. And some of them are on dialysis. And we're very concerned about their health conditions right now and the need to be safe. They live within the park, they work within the park, and we need to work together with the park to come up with some plans to ensure that my tribal people and other tribal members that work there be safe. And that's why we are very honored to join this forum to voice the concerns of what is happening at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. We all need to work together to ensure safety for all people, the visitors, the tribal members, and also we need to be consulted as tribal leaders and tribal governments. We can't just make decisions and put the safety of all citizens of Arizona in danger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman. We're so grateful to have you here, and thank you very much for your testimony. Next, I will go to Mr. Phil Francis. Mr. Francis began his 41-year career at the National Park Service in 1972 when he served as a seasonal park ranger and as a permanent administrative employee at Kings Mountain National Military Park. It is obvious to say that he is a dedicated public servant and very knowledgeable about our national parks, and I welcome you, Mr. Francis. You have 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland. I appreciate it, and I really feel for the President Nez and Carletta for your family, and I wish you nothing but the best. I did spend 41 years in the National Park Service, working 5 different regions. I've spent some time at the Grand Canyon. I've spent time in New Mexico. I've spent time in Arizona. I've been around the block, to say the least. But the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks has been extremely active throughout the pandemic, advocating for the health and safety of the National Park Service employees, concession employees, volunteers, and other partners, including those who work and live in gateway communities. We pushed hard for national parks to close until a time when the health and well-being of our National Park Service employees and visitors could be ensured. Despite the administration's determination to push Americans into national parks, as seen by their misguided decision to waive park entrance fees at the onset of the pandemic, the coalition maintained that we should not be encouraging more visitation to our national parks when gathering at other public spaces was not considered safe. Thanks to pressure from state governments, local communities, leaders, and public health and advocacy groups, over 250 parks in the national park system were closed or partially closed. But there was no national leadership or plan, and the approach was chaotic and piecemeal. Now, in a similarly disorganized fashion, President Trump and Secretary Bernhardt are pushing for those parks to reopen. The effort to close and reopen in conformance with CDC guidelines has been challenging for the National Park Service. When Great Smoky Mountains National Park partially reopened, as you mentioned, Chairwoman, in your remarks, visitors came and 30,000 people came. Areas that were closed, people ignored the barricades. They went around the barricades, thousands of them. And social distancing was not observed, nor were people wearing masks. The recently completed National Park Service Safety Plan acknowledges that park staff should try not to enforce social distancing or CDC guidelines, and visitors should be notified that they should adjust their expectations accordingly and should practice social distancing, personal hygiene, and other behaviors to avoid infection in public areas. Visitors should not rely upon site staff to ensure their protection from contagious disease. While parks may move from phase 1 to phase 2 and finally phase 3, the NPS safety plan recognizes that what happens on the ground may be inconsistent and parks may have to return to a previous phase, but only when the locality and the state moves back to a more conservative posture, which is not likely going to happen. Then the NPS units and offices in that geography may do so as well. That is not leadership. It is too soon to open our national parks. Parks should be following the most cautious standards to ensure the safety of all involved in park operations, as well as visitors who visit the parks and utilize services provided in gateway communities. They must be able to demonstrate they have adequate staff to protect resources and protective equipment available to those staff members. There should be a system-wide and individual park plans to be put in place prior to reopening, including safety plans that ensure compliance with CDC and OSHA workplace safety guidelines and NPS safety policy. These plans should be distributed to park employees and be made available to the public, which they will not do. Superintendents, in consultation with our local communities, must be delegated that authority to make decisions about when it's safe to open. They should be not treated as pawns in a larger political game. We have publicly expressed concern about the lack of transparency by the Department of the Interior and the NPS. DOI is one of the few federal departments not disclosing the number of its employees that have been infected. We have been unable to identify how many employees, partners, or volunteers have been infected by COVID-19, nor have we been able to obtain park-level plans for managing parks during the pandemic. On April 20th of this year, we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, but we have not received any answer. In fact, we submitted another request, and we were told that only 3 FOIA requests have been taken care of in the last 6 weeks. Now, we're aware that employee infection information is to be accumulated by the NPS, by a watch office, yet we can't get that information. And we recognize there's great benefit to being in great outdoors. We recognize the importance of the economy, but we think the safety of our employees, our neighbors, our visiting public should be #1 priority.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. We appreciate your testimony. Next, we will go to Dan Puskar. He's been the president and CEO of the Public Lands Alliance since June of 2013 and has had a lifelong love of the outdoors, especially when it comes to hiking. So, Mr. Puskar, thank you so much for being here. We value your testimony, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Vice Chair Holland. Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you, President Nez, Councilwoman Tilous, Mr. Francis. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting Public Lands Alliance to share the perspective of nonprofit partners of the National Park Service on the reopening of national parks in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. PLA believes that the process of fully reopening the national parks, all public lands, should focus first and foremost on the safety and well-being of visitors, employees, volunteers, and gateway communities. This has always been the promise of national parks. They were created for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. They're not only amazing scenic landscapes, but they reflect the face of America in all of its diversity. That's why the homes and landscapes important to Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Harriet Tubman are today parks, alongside sites of revolution and protest, from Minuteman to Stonewall National Monument. And it's why the National Park Service is a leader in providing opportunities for people to express their First Amendment rights, to protest and assemble. I'm here today to talk to you about the need for safety and well-being in our national parks as a consequence of COVID-19. But I really must begin by expressing my own profound sadness for today's headlines that lead with a story about how a national park, Lafayette Square, has not been a safe place for Americans seeking justice. It makes me ache. I do not believe the harm to peaceful protesters that we saw last evening in Lafayette Square in any way reflects the character or values of the National Park Service. For those of you who know its superintendents and the people in its ranks, they care deeply about the health and safety of visitors. And the Public Lands and our Lands Alliance and our members are here to stand with them to ensure our parks embrace and welcome every person of color, every American, with open arms, when it can be safe and the well-being of everyone is maintained. And it's within that context that we must turn to COVID-19 as well. And I'd like to speak briefly with you about 3 issues: the ways in which our members, the nonprofit partners of America's public lands, including the national parks, are partnering with the Park Service through these challenging times, how we're planning with the future, and what we think Congress might be able to do to help us a little bit more. Those who have already spoken have spoken eloquently to the challenges of needing the national park system to engage closely with their gateway communities, to ensure that healthcare infrastructure nearby our parks and the impacts to tourism will not harm those local communities or those who work inside them. I thank all 3 of your witnesses for that. I'd like to focus then for a moment on the ways in which, in the face of reopening, National Park Service really has an opportunity to collaborate closely on all aspects of the visitor experience with their operational partners, including nonprofit partners that manage retail stores, conduct educational programs, manage volunteers, build trails, help preserve natural, historical, and cultural resources. Across the nation, nonprofit partners are working with the National Park Service to figure out the challenges we're talking about. We're working together with concessioners and others to determine what kind of personal protective equipment is needed by staff. And they need guidance. The Park Service needs guidance that makes it clear what rangers will be doing and what they expect of visitors. We're talking about how we'll deal with the challenges of housing when it is impossible to bring as many staff into our parks to operate them, given that they are not set up in large Western rural parks. Dormitory living is not abnormal for park staff, including nonprofit employees, concession employees. In a time of COVID, we cannot step up operations like we used to. And in delivering services, we need to think about how to be innovative on the ground so that where we are used to seeing people engage in the nonprofit retail stores in almost every national park visitor center, we now need to be thinking about the ways in which we innovate to curbside pickup for the things that visitors need, rather than getting them in close and tight quarters. Sending a unified message to visitors about the ways in which people can expect to be safe once they enter park grounds. Our request of the National Park Service in all of this is that they make decisions first and foremost based in science and the best practices of keeping people safe. Partnering together then for the future, we expect a lot of changes. Nonprofit park partners are engaged heavily in retail. They're in the tourism industry. They're bringing youth to the parks to engage in service activities. And all of these are threatened by the ways in which we do not have the resources coming in, the revenues that are needed to be able to keep them going. Donations are down. Lack of retail sales mean you may not be able to hire seasonal employees. The loss of recreation fees mean that conservation corps will not be deployed on the land. Within all of this, then, we ask Congress for help on the ground. Thank you so much for your support last week in the House, overwhelmingly for the Payment Protection Program Flexibility Act. Nonprofits are small businesses out there. They need the flexibility you have created to ensure that they are perpetual partners for the parks. I urge you to support the Great American Outdoors Act to ensure that as we recover the national parks, the Land and Water Conservation Fund and deferred maintenance is fully funded within it. And finally, I urge the committee to consider ways in which more funding may be needed to supplement what the parks have lost in donations, in recreation fees, and other things they need to provide the services and the safety visitors expect. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Puskar. And now we will move to questions by our members of Congress. Thank you, my colleagues, for being here today. Very grateful for you. And I will recognize Chairman Ruben Gallego. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman, for arranging this, and thank you to our guests for working with us through this very, let's say, difficult times. But we are enjoying our jobs as stewards of our land and oversight, obviously. My first question is for Councilwoman Tilous. I'm extremely happy to hear that there's been 0 cases confirmed coronavirus or COVID-19 on the Havasupai tribal reservation, despite the outbreaks all around you. So it's a credit to your tribal government for having such strong leadership. Can you kind of talk to us about some of the measures you put in place to make sure that that spread did not come into your community?
Yes, Representative Gallegos, thank you for your question. And in the beginning of March, we took swift action to declare a state of emergency because of this pandemic. We closed the canyon first to all tourists that were in the canyon. We asked them to leave within 48 hours. The ones that were down there. And then we also restricted all travel in and out of the canyon for all tribal members and non-tribal members. And we also enacted a stay-at-home and mandatory quarantine for all residents in Supai Village. And we all also, even though we don't really have the manpower, we started taking temperatures of every elder, every household, to make sure on a daily basis that their temperatures were not high. We also started a lot of supplies to make sure and taking all those steps has really helped us quarantine ourselves from the outside world, basically, to keep ourselves safe. And those are the first big steps that we took. Thank you.
Sorry about that. In terms of the administration's plans for reopening, how does that affect your efforts? And is there anything the administration can do, I think, to more align with the goals and the efforts and the success that your tribe has had so far?
We have been working really hard to send letters to the administration, and to this day, we have not received a response from the Department of Interior. We are disappointed with the administration's lack of response to keep the park closed during the duration of this pandemic. Despite the surges of the positive cases surrounding the Grand Canyon, they're still opening the state of Arizona and allowing the visitors to come through on state roads through our neighboring tribes' reservations and exposing our visitors and possibly our tribal members. And that's our biggest concern. And it seems to me that the park and the Grand Canyon Park and the administration is not taking our pleas seriously. We're going to work hard to continue to write letters and do what we can in our capacity. But we are a vulnerable population, and our letters should not be ignored. The tribe has recently spoken to the new park superintendent, Edward Keeble, and while he seemed open to our tribe's concerns, he did not provide a rational plan or a rational ideas to create a safety plan for the people that are living and working in the park. And again, we still have not received a response from Secretary Bernhardt on our letters. or acknowledgement of the receipt of our letters.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And I think it's really important for those that maybe aren't familiar with your tribe. You know, your majority of your funds come from tourism. And for one of the most beautiful places I have heard, I'm going to try to get there as soon as it's safely to reopen. I want to come out and visit and bring my friends so they could see how beautiful it is. But, you know, when the tribe, you know, shut its doors to protect itself, it essentially was cutting itself off from its lifeblood of funds that fund tribal government. So this was not an easy decision that you made. And it was a decision that saved lives, and you should be commended for it. And you're continuing to try to do what's best for your community. And it's a shame that you have a Department of Interior that isn't, I think, as in the fight as you are. And thank you again. I'd like to move on to a question for President Nez if I have time. And President Nez, again, amazing work you're doing out there in a very challenging environment. We know, you know, that this has not been an easy time, but I'm proud to say that you are, you know, leading in a very tough time and leading well. How did, you know, with that in mind, how did the department here respond to your initial request to close the Grand Canyon and to the more recent request to keep it closed?
All right. Thank you for the question, Representative Gallegos and subcommittee members, Chairwoman, and you too. I think we didn't foresee all of us governing through a pandemic. And I also want to say thank you to each and every one of you for the work that you all are doing. We need to get that HEROES Act approved, and we need to get more resources to tribal nations, tribal communities, not pass through the federal programs and departments or through the states, but directly to the people, tribal people. And Representative Gallegos, thank you for the question. You know, we did send a letter with our concerns to the park leadership as well as the secretary to let them know that we are still in a increase in COVID positive here on the Navajo Nation. And we are reminding them that we do have some strict public health orders. I think some say that there are some of the strictest in the country because, you know, as you know, we waited for over 7 weeks before what you all approved, the CARES Act, and we had to file against Treasury to get our share of resources. And so those 7 weeks, tribes were left to their own doings, I guess, if you want to call it that, because we had to get some aid from the friends throughout the country to help us through those 7 weeks. And, you know, right now we are, I think, flattening out the curve. But when we did at the peak, we asked National Parks Secretary Bernhardt to keep that in mind because we don't want visitors to be detained. We don't want them to have to pay $1,000 citation because they're going through our lands. But again, like I said earlier, nobody, no federal, no state, nobody told visitors that Navajo Nation has those policies in place, regulations in place. And so I'm afraid that some of our visitors were cited, and that may discourage their return to our nation when this pandemic is over. We rely heavily on the tourism industry, and now's not the time to be on the Navajo Nation. But what the Grand Canyon did was they closed the route that comes from the Grand Canyon into the Navajo Nation, and vice versa. That's the route that goes to Cameron, Arizona. And, but it wasn't, you know, strictly enforced, is what I'm hearing from the parks in. And so we had visitors coming through on their way to Page Lake Powell, right? I mean, we had tons of people coming from Phoenix, Flagstaff, going through the Navajo Nation to go to the lake during Memorial Day weekend and then just this past weekend. And just showing that no one really, or visitors didn't know what's going on, or they just on purpose, didn't abide by our laws and regulations here on Navajo. And so, and there was a last meeting, as I said, with Secretary Bernhardt. Secretary Bernhardt did say that he is following his boss, and his boss is the president. So the president wanted all the national parks to be open, and so that's what has transpired up to now. And we're still seeing high cases of coronavirus here on Navajo, and we're doing our very best to regulate and to stop and slow down the spread here on our nation. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Governor, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. Next, for questions, I will go to Representative Ed Case. I will recognize him now, and thank you, Mr. Case. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for this hearing, very important hearing. And to President Nez and Council Member Tilous, I send you greetings and aloha from the indigenous peoples of Hawaii, the Native Hawaiians, who are standing with you during this very difficult time, especially for the Navajo Nation. The Native Hawaiians have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, but not nearly to the extent that you are dealing with it there in Navajo Nation. But I know that they would want me to extend to you their thoughts and prayers. I think that this hearing is important because not only is our goal here, I believe, to provide for the safety of those that visit our national parks and work in our national parks, and those who live in and around our national parks, and frankly, the safety of the folks that all of the above have to go back to, be in contact with. So those procedures in terms of premature opening, it seems to me I'm on the same page as everybody else here. But I think also, does this not offer us an opportunity to perhaps rethink our national parks and to reopen them better than they were, more safe, a heightened visitor experience, a better overall environment? And have you given thought to that kind of advocacy in our national park system? In my home state of Hawaii, a particular area of great concern are tour helicopter overflights. Of course, that's a major issue for the Grand Canyon, where this whole issue really came to the forefront decades ago. And we have, of course, have a number of federal laws that are trying to deal with that. We just had a major federal appeals court in DC decision out of a case that arose in Hawaii, requiring the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration to develop air tour management plans for the 16, I think it was, targeted high risk, high volume national parks across the country. FAA and NPS had dragged their feet on those for decades. Here in Hawaii, we have two beautiful national parks in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park and Haleakala National Park, which happen to be the #1 and #2 tour helicopter overflight parks in the entire country. And there was just a study released in the Journal of Park and Recreation Administration entitled Special Issue on Innovation Methodologies in Park and Recreation Management, published online May 5th, 2020. This was actually a study of systematic study of automatic dependent surveillance technology on helicopters that tracked them spatially. So, exact location, exact altitudes, and found that over 50% of the tour helicopters at Haleakala were violating some form of agreement. And so the question for me, and perhaps this is best directed to Mr. Francis or Mr. Puskar, does this give an opportunity for the nonprofits and folks that care very much about our national parks to not only strengthen the safety side of things, but the overall experience side of things? And have you pursued any of those options through your nonprofit organizations and/or the National Park Service?
Sure, we have. And I sympathize with your helicopter overflight issue. I worked in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 11 years. We had the very same issue. Helicopters would fly so low that it would blow the hats off of hikers along the trails. And after many years of debate, an ordinance was passed. But with regard to safety, years ago, when John Jarvis was our director, he started a new program called Operational Leadership. That model required the National Park Service to assess every task that was being performed, and that if the risk couldn't be sufficiently mitigated, an employee would not have to do the task. That kind of analysis is obviously not been done during this pandemic. Everybody should have the opportunity to have their tasks be evaluated and a reasonable amount of safety provided to each and every person. You know, in a place like the Great Smokies or any of the national parks, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite, one of the challenges is that we don't have the staffing anymore that we once had. We've lost thousands of employees. The law enforcement ranger function has lost over 20% of its staff over the past 11 years. And so when you're trying to manage epidemic, if you're trying to manage visitation, too many people, if you're trying to manage social distancing, you know, and you're trying to cover 500,000 acres and 900 miles of trails, it's just not possible. And the way the parks are designed, it brings people together, such as the South Rim of the Grand Canyon, where you go to a parking lot, you know, everybody wants to see down inside the canyon. And so with thousands and thousands of people coming every day, people are going to come in close contact with each other. And this idea that the public is going to take care of their own safety has not been demonstrated. People are coming to national parks in large numbers. And I'm sure you're seeing visitation in Hawaii. And boy, I love Haleakala, what a great place. But people are going to get too close and they're not wearing masks. And the National Park Service safety plan is not requiring them to do so. You know, when I go to the local grocery store, I can't get in the door without wearing a mask. And so those kinds of safeguards, I mean, just consider where all your visitors are coming from. You don't know where they are. You don't know if they've been infected. You don't know if they've had any training. You don't know if they've prepared before they arrived. But more has to be done. And at the Grand Canyon, I know for a fact that they were asked to open before their safety plan was created. And so we have been asking for safety plans from every park to be made available to the public. So you can imagine what the answer has been. No answer. We've got to do something about the being able to get information from the parks in this department.
Appreciate that very much, Mr. Francis. And Dan, my time is up, so I apologize for that. I'd love to continue this conversation with you outside the hearing. Chair Holland, I would ask unanimous consent that the report that I referenced be entered into the record of this hearing.
Without objection.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you all. I will next go to my colleague, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell of Michigan, for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Howland, for convening this important forum to discuss how we can ensure the safety of the National Park Service employees and visitors on America's public lands. The United States, as we know, is continuing to face a rapidly evolving public health crisis because of COVID-19. And given the significant number of cases, as well as the potential for overcrowding, in the Ionic National Parks, like the Grand Canyon, the need for robust public health safeguards and on America's public lands is greater than ever. However, as my colleagues and witnesses have mentioned, there's been virtually no input, zero input from local stakeholders and communities as the administration has decided to proceed with reopening the national parks. Near some of the communities that are the most impacted by the virus, and all of you just talked about that. President Nez, the Navajo Nation has been hard hit by the coronavirus, with more cases per capita than any United States state. The reopening of national parks like the Grand Canyon has significant public health implications for your community. In fact, you reached out May 11th to the Secretary of Interior, I believe, and the National Park Service, urging them to postpone reopening of the national parks. What was the response to your outreach?
Thank you for the question, Representative and subcommittee members, Chairwoman Holland. I will share the response that we received from the Park Service. I know that they're wanting to sit down to discuss further with me and the leadership on their move to open up all the parks, national monuments in and around the Navajo Nation. In the Navajo Nation, we have Canyon de Chelly, we have Navajo National Monument, we have Hubble trading posts that are overseen by the Interior, and we got Grand Canyon, we have Chaco, and minis around in Utah, and we also have our tribal parks. So our tribal parks have been closed since the start of this pandemic, when we've closed government down. And, the deadline to revisit that is coming up June 7th. And the way it looks, and I haven't announced this, but I guess now it's going to get announced, is that we're entertaining the continuation of the closure of the nation. And so the response that we received recently from the national parks is that they'd like to sit down and talk. But like I said earlier, I think the decision has already been made by the chief executive here to open all of them back up and all the parks back up. And there's just going to be a lot of visitors coming to our nation. And I hate for our shelter in place order to give them a bad experience, especially if they do get cited or something similar to North Dakota were to happen. South Dakota. So there's a concern there.
But they've made announcements without really meaningfully consulted you, right? They've asked you post the decision. So they didn't consult you before they made the decision.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Francis, I'm running out of time, but so, we are approaching the high peak season. Can you describe for us what it's like in a national park, typically during peak season, so that we physically understand why this is such a danger?
Sure, I certainly can. I've had a great opportunity to work in the most visited unit of the national park system, the most visited national park. I worked in Yosemite, and I've seen big crowds. And people come, they come often unprepared. They want to see the national parks. I've seen people hike down a canyon without having water, but it's just throngs and throngs of people. Long lines on the road to get inside of a national park, and once inside the national park, I've seen long lines to leave. I've seen thousands and thousands of people on a 1 mile trail hiking to see a waterfall. And they're shoulder to shoulder. On the Blue Ridge Parkway, where we have about 15 million visitors a year, about 4 times that as the Grand Canyon. You know, people are gathered at overlooks, they gather on trails where there's not restrooms, they find a place to go anyway. And so it is a public health risk. It is a safety risk to our employees. It's a safety risk to the visitors. And when people go back to the adjoining communities, or in the case of the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or Yellowstone, when they go back to their lodge or their campgrounds, they're going to be shoulder to shoulder again, unless strict measures are taken.
And I yield back. We're over time, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And so I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions now. And Mr. Puskar, I'll start with you. As the president and CEO of an organization that represents nonprofit partners of America's public lands, can you briefly describe some of the impacts that the coronavirus pandemic has had on your members? What are some of the challenges that Alliance members are facing when it comes to reopening? And can you briefly describe some of the steps that your members are taking to ensure that they return to business as usual in a safe and responsible manner?
Certainly, Congresswoman. A few things. Our members have been greatly impacted. They are businesses that operate related to a tourist attraction, our national parks. Their revenue is going to come by visitors who come and then want to donate to their philanthropic organization. They are there to help manage volunteers who are not there because they cannot be. They're there to sell educational products, and there's no way to do that in a closed park. So like you see across the country, when you're in retail, when you're in tourism, people are suffering. They will need to lay off staff. They will need to reduce their operations by hundreds and thousands of people, but for things like the PPP loans and being able to get back into some form of regularity in a safe way. They are engaged at a local level to kind of innovation then that Congressman Case asked about. Now, the things that Mr. Francis was just talking about, the challenges of what you have with people going shoulder to shoulder down trails. Park partners are working together to figure out how do you mitigate that? How can you change traffic flows on trails or change the way trails are managed so that we don't have that kind of thing happen so people can be safe? Can we rethink the way people enter into visitor centers, or maybe not enter into them at all and set up kiosks on the outside so that people can engage and get the information or products they need to be able to safely go through the park without having to get in a contained, confined space. There's innovation happening at Manzanar National Historical Park right now, where since there is a line of cars now building up to get into the park, because they just can't have that many people inside and are fortunately restricting those numbers, they're giving people an opportunity to order the things they need in the park store from their phone while sitting in line so they can get it for curbside pickup and not get into a situation where they might infect one another. Mm-hmm. Long term, I have to say, there are both pluses and minuses to our partnerships that are happening. And I think I do want to say, I think there is a distinction between what we're finding in national guidance and what some superintendents, lots of superintendents are doing out there. There may not be good guidance coming from the administration saying, work with your tribes, work with your gateway communities. But I know a lot of our partners who have superintendents doing exactly that. They're trying, in the face of unclear guidance and inconsistent messages, to ensure the safety of their people. And I do want to make that distinction, because for many, our partnerships are getting stronger through this trying time because we have to innovate. We have to think differently to ensure the safety of our own people and the visitor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that in-depth answer. And Councilwoman Tilous, I will go to you next. Let's see. How would you characterize the administration's response to the Havasupai tribe's request that Grand Canyon National Park remain closed for the duration of this pandemic? And have you or any representatives spoken directly to Secretary Bernhardt or the superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park about any of your concerns?
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland, for the question. Yes, we have met briefly over the phone with the newly seated superintendent. And as I mentioned before, he seemed concerned, but didn't really provide any direct commitments to ensure that the safety of the residents of Supai Camp, where our tribal members reside, are going to be safe. There was no plan to let us know that the employees are going to be safe, the tribal employees and the visitors. We had questions about, are the employees going to wear masks? Or are they going to be asked to stay only in certain areas? All those things we had questions about, and we have not received any direct answers. Again, we did write several letters to Secretary Bernhardt. We have not been acknowledged that the letters were received or any response. We're a tribal government. We're a sovereign nation. We should be given that respect, that we did receive your letter and we will respond to you. We haven't received that yet. So it seems to be our voices, our efforts, and putting our letters in writing to higher ups in DC have fallen on deaf ears. And we need to all sit together and talk to one another or Zoom with one another and come with a plan to ensure that everyone needs to be safe. This is a very scary time in history, and we cannot risk. There's so much risk out there, and we cannot risk not only my people, a small population of people, but the visitors that are coming through. And that's the scariest part. And unfortunately, during this time, this administration has failed to hear the voices of Native people, and specifically the Southwest, and all the deaths that are happening. A lot of us have very close relatives that have died very recently, and we are in mourning. We are heartbroken on what is happening. And all we need is support to continue our efforts that we have already done to protect our communities and to protect our people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Councilwoman. Thank you, President Nez. Thank you, Mr. Francis and Mr. Puskar. We appreciate you being here, and we thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Your answers have helped us tremendously, that we can make the right decisions moving forward. And we are adjourned of this virtual forum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.